if you found a portal to a parallel universe? What if you could slide into 1,000 different worlds?
Hello and welcome to How to Fix It. 2020 caused a lot of important things to be delayed or outright cancelled. Films and TV were delayed, conventions delayed, but of course the most important thing that was unfortunately cancelled in 2020 was my yearly Sliders review. I kid, obviously, but I was disappointed that I wasn't in the right headspace to do it, especially because it had been the 25th anniversary of Sliders, and I'd intended to do a new overview video, which might still happen. 26 years is still a milestone, right? But for the moment, I'm in the mood to do a Sliders review right now, even if it's not my usual time of the year for it. Honestly, that was coincidence more than anything. It's just that was the time of year that I usually got back into the mood to watch Sliders, but it was never really on purpose. Anyway, I'm sure you all have one burning question for me. Why didn't I do a viewer poll to decide which episode I was going to do? Well, two reasons. One, this is sort of spur of the moment, and I didn't want to delay it by polling. And two, I've had this episode in the list since the first viewer request poll, and you guys never pick it. If I want to review it, I'm going to have to make the executive decision myself, and yes, that means we're finally tackling To Catch a Slider. But trust me, it's still plenty bad. In fact, I'd argue that I find it to be worse than any of the episodes that you actually did pick in the poll. Honestly, I always felt the reason that you guys never picked this one was because you were showing mercy. But I made that first poll like 4 years ago, so maybe I've softened on it. Stranger things have happened on this show. Well, that's what we're here to find out. So, let's slide into To Catch a Slider. Our episode opens with Rembrandt and Mallory getting some clunky exposition about the premise of the season out of the way, that they're searching for Rembrandt's Earth before Mallory and Diana get a chance to figure out their own stuff, mixed in with some good old-fashioned 90s-era sexism.
I think it's genetic. You know any men who obsessively try on shoes?
'Cause women be shopping, huh? And trust me, if that was the only strike against this episode, I'd be glad. However, that crisis is quickly overshadowed by another. The timer is on the fritz, and despite it previously having given them a day before they had to slide, it quickly becomes 30 seconds. The timer has been acting strange for a few episodes, and now it's finally come to a head as we see the group in the vortex for much longer than usual before they're spit out, dragged back in, and left frozen in the void as the opening titles play. And since I don't know where else to mention this, Maggie's look in the episode seems rather familiar to me as a Doctor Who fan. So either Maggie is ahead of the curve on fashion, or Martha Jones was going retro. After the titles, they're spit back out into a pile of trash, and the timer seems to be back to normal. Diana scans the timer and figures out that something is up with it relating to its ability to hone in on specific dimensional coordinates, and Mallory and Maggie lament that Quinn didn't leave behind a backup timer and the fact that Quinn is seemingly lost. But Rembrandt sets them straight with some backstory, relating how the current timer they have is one that they found on Egypt World back in Slide Like an Egyptian, and not the original one Quinn made in the pilot, meaning that even Quinn might not know how or have the proper equipment to fix it. As they walk toward the Chandler Hotel, Maggie is distracted by some jewelry in the window.
Look at that. The timer's blown, we may not be able to fix it, and she still wants to shop.
Okay, to be fair, when I originally wrote my notes on this like 4 years ago, I was with Mallory on this, especially since it seemed as if the writers were being sexist by making Maggie interested in jewelry just because she's a woman. But now I think they just made Mallory sexist so that we dislike him even more than we already do because he's not Jerry O'Connell. Shut up, Mallory! Oh, and I shouldn't have to say this, but just in case, Robert Floyd, the actor playing Mallory, is not the reason that I sometimes dislike Mallory. It's the writing. Robert Floyd is fine. The hotel is bustling because of a particular film festival, and that means it's time for the Season 4 and 5 replacement for Will Sasso's Gomez Calhoun to show up. The sassy Spanish desk clerk.
Reservations?
No, this is a spur-of-the-moment kind of thing.
Not a good time to have a spur.
Who you may remember from Lipschitz Live, where he was so distracted by the TV that he barely acknowledged our heroes. I can't put my finger on why, but I feel like this is offensive somehow. They're also advised by plot-required exposition that each room has a digital safe with a unique password in it. If the title of the episode hadn't already given it away, this episode is about stealing. We're also introduced to Monique Mansfield, a sexy movie star that quickly seduces Mallory, who falls in love with her instantly. You may recognize her as Lisa Stahl if you watched a lot of TV in the 90s, or a lot of internet reviewers now, since she was also Destiny DeSimone on Baywatch and its spin-off Baywatch Nights. Diana also gets some attention from a random guy at the bar. Later on, Diana starts working on the timer, leading into what is somehow not the dumbest conversation in this episode.
Hey, that thing's Egyptian. How are you gonna understand how it works?
It shouldn't make a difference.
Well, why not? It's a different language, a different culture, different time.
No, it isn't. The intro was very clear on this. It's same year, different dimension. It's the modern day, just in a different universe where different things happened. Do you think that actual Egypt is using different math too? And given that they also invented sliding in a way that, allow me to remind you, was able to interface with the sliding technology on Maggie's original Earth, doesn't that indicate that the math wouldn't be that different? Listen, if I've had to sit through all this dreck, at the least the characters can do is remember those episodes. With as many callbacks as this episode is making to past episodes, how does that slip through? Diana asks Rembrandt if he remembers anything about the timer that Quinn or the professor might have mentioned, but Rembrandt doesn't remember much apart from
Scarabs.
What?
There was a lot of discussion about scarabs.
And you should definitely pay attention to what the Scarab says. Like you should subscribe to their channel, leave a comment on their video, and, if possible, support the Black Scarab Films Patreon. What? It was worth a shot. Using her sonic screwdriver, Diana discovers that the timer utilizes a gem in its design, one that resembles the ones in the jewelry store in the lobby and the one around Monique Mansfield's neck. They start at the store, but the living gems, which have special properties, are a little too pricey for the sliders to afford.
$9,000?
Of course.
Which leads Mallory into suggesting an alternate method of acquiring the gem.
Guess there's only one thing to do.
Yeah.
What's that?
We're just gonna have to steal one.
You son of a bitch! I'm in!
While planning their hypothetical heist, Mallory cites Mission Impossible with Tom Cruise, and Rembrandt mentions Sneakers, which Mallory says he likes, which implies that Mallory's Earth had both the Mission Impossible movies and the film Sneakers, which is always a problem with this show. It's very hard to do relevant pop culture stuff if every world is supposed to be distinct from each other. Rembrandt, who has somehow become the dad friend of the group, despite being the comic relief in Season 1, points out how ridiculous the entire situation is and how their plan is reckless and stupid.
Look at you. You're talking about breaking and entering, burglary, grand larceny. Now, the way I see it, we might as well forget about sliding. Because jail time is going to add up to a whole lot more than 29 years.
You know what that is? It's gross.
We also learn that Mallory knows how to knock over a jewelry store, which isn't that surprising after his admission to hot wiring cars back in Please Press 1. But as Mallory harangues Rembrandt for his sudden anti-crime stance, given that, in fairness, Remy finances their adventures by stealing money from his double's bank accounts, Mallory is contacted by Monique and invited up to her suite, which Diana initially balks at, but Maggie correctly recognizes that if Mallory can get close to her, he can steal her necklace, which is far safer than cat burglary. Diana also gets to know her suitor from the bar, Grant Curtis, who seems interested in her interest in the living gems. Grant very obviously flirts with her and reveals that he sells living gems, meaning that there's now a third option for their procurement of a suitable gemstone, and Grant invites Diana to dinner to discuss the gems more. Mallory goes up to Monique's suite, and she invites Mallory down to the pool to watch her do a photo op and reveals that she talks about herself in the third person.
Now, on the way, I want you to tell Monique all about you. Just the good points. Things that will impress Monique and make her want to do naughty things.
That gives them enough of an in that Mallory knows that Monique and her entourage will be at a premiere party and won't be in the room, giving them a chance to sneak in and take the gem, which Monique isn't allowed to wear to the premiere because, ironically, the insurance company won't let her wear it because they're afraid it'll get stolen. Their plan is pretty simple. Diana hacks the front desk computer to reset the code and open the safe, Maggie and Mallory go inside to do the actual stealing, and Rembrandt coordinates everything from an adjacent rooftop. Everything seems to be going well, with Diana able to leave her date to handle her part of the bargain, slightly subverting the usual expectation of person on date botches job because they're distracted by said date. And to be fair, this is a pretty good sequence because much like Way Out West, they're having fun parodying the genre instead of aping it for legitimate drama. Unfortunately, the job goes pear-shaped when Mallory and Maggie are confronted by a second burglar, who decks Mallory before he can escape the room, like both the burglar and Maggie when the authorities show up, including Grant, Diana's date. But that doesn't mean Mallory gets fingered for the crime, since he hops under the covers and plays off his presence like he was snuck in and was waiting for Monique to return, which they believe, which also leads to Monique walking in right after the cops depart and makes the same inference about Mallory's presence, and he ends up spending the night with her to his probable delight. In the morning, Mallory gives the team a heads up about Grant, but before they have a chance to warn her, Grant admits to Diana that he's not in the business of selling, he's in the business of protecting. He works for that previously mentioned insurance company and is investigating a rash of gem burglaries. And he asks for Diana's help, needing her to wear the most valuable of his company's living gems to lure out the burglar for a sting operation. He even lets the other sliders in on the sting, although I imagine it's more because it requires them to use their suite rather than main characters do everything. That night, they prep for the second heist, this time on the side of the authorities, and hang on, they have all that stuff from their attempted heist. Did Grant pick them because they had their own gear? Or did he offer his gear and they were like, nah, we're good? Did he not even question why they have their own stuff? It's not like every random tourist carries surveillance equipment with them. Anyway, Diana goes out to the party and does her part, showing off the diamond and then returning it to their suite to place it in the safe, before heading back to the party to await the burglar. While dancing, Monique goes off to powder her nose, and Mallory is left with the most important job of all, taking care of Monique's chihuahua. Coming this fall to NBC, The Adventures of Mallory, Dog Holder. Come on, let's go get some Taco Bell. Rembrandt calls the hammer down when he sees someone breaking into their suite, but it turns out to be the one next door, played for laughs since Rembrandt miscounted the suites, until Diana is called in to open the safe and instead finds a hand. So the thief was Thing from the Addams Family the entire time. Truly he's fallen on hard times since the made-for-TV movie didn't pan out. No, of course it's the second burglar, using a hole in the wall to bust into the back of the safe. Apparently the weakest point, which seems like a terrible design flaw, but whatever, the episode is almost over. Who Grant quickly runs to apprehend, and the second burglar turns out to be Monique herself. Grant figures it was part of an insurance scam and cites that Monique was present at 2 other film festivals that had nearby living gem exhibits. For some reason, is that a thing in Hollywood, jewelry exhibits near movie stars? Anyway, then Grant drops the bomb, which, given that the episode is fairly stock in terms of dated 90s-era humor, will explain why I consider this to be one of the worst episodes of the show. Monique Mansfield is not only a criminal, but also
the most successful cross-dressing performer in the world.
Which elicits some giggles and teasing of Mallory due to his infatuation and possible sexual relationship with Monique. When I originally took notes for this episode back when I ran the poll in 2017, my only note for that part of the episode was,
Einhorn is Finkel. Finkel is Einhorn! Einhorn is a man!
But to borrow a turn of phrase from Linkara, 1990s casual transphobia. And given that this episode is part of the same era of ridiculously transphobic jokes as Ace Ventura, even if they go to lengths to ensure that we know that Monique was just a cross-dresser and not identified as transgender, perhaps in a way of covering their asses because they knew it was a shitty joke, it is still pretty tone-deaf today, and was likely tone-deaf back then. It's just that nobody was really watching Sliders at this point, so no one really noticed or cared. I mean, it's not all that surprising. If you're new here, this is the same show that explained the departure of Sabrina Lloyd's beloved character Wade Wells, as her having been sent to a Cro-Mag breeding camp, which the executive producer David Peckinpah was on record as saying was funny. Allegedly. Since it's been so long, I can't find any actual evidence of that, but based on the content of the show under him, it really wouldn't surprise me. So, casual transphobia is pretty far down the list of heinous moments used for comedic effect on Sliders. And, well, all's well that ends well, since Diana ends up returning the living gem they intended to pocket to Grant because the reward money for solving the case, which I'm pretty sure is not how that works, will be able to pay for Diana to own one of her very own, solving their problem and allowing the Sliders to head off towards their next adventure. The opening of the episode is really cool and sets up an interesting episode that we never saw. No, not that shoe shopping joke, which doubly doesn't work because one of the people making fun of it is Rembrandt, who was all about shopping back in season 1 to 3. I mean, the part where they got stuck in the vortex. It'd be a logistical nightmare because of the effects work involved, and by this point the show was 100% reliant on subsisting off the Universal backlot, which gives us such humorous images as Smash Mouth featuring the Chandler Hotel in the music video for their cover of I'm a Believer from the Shrek soundtrack, and the crew walking past the Hill Valley Clock Tower. But that's never happened before, and it's a fairly effective cliffhanger if you go into the episode completely blind. Of course, it's completely undercut if you know the actual plot is about a heist, but it works in a vacuum. And as for that scene inside the vortex, the special effects are decent considering the time and lack of budget that Sliders usually had. Sure, I was never the biggest fan of the blue and green vortex, but it actually looks pretty convincing compared to the effects shots from back when the show was on Fox. And you know what? The idea of the timer breaking down isn't a bad premise for an episode, especially since they seeded in the timer acting weird in the last episode. So it's not some random problem out of nowhere, and it makes perfect sense that it would break down not too long after Quinn isn't around to do maintenance. We'd seen them do maintenance or fixing it before, but remember, it was always Quinn or Professor Arturo doing it since they're the scientist, and we established in Jillian of the Spirits that it was definitely more Quinn's thing, since Arturo didn't have the patience to do it. I'm sure Quinn was upkeeping that thing in the background since they got the Egyptian timer. But once he's gone, so does that maintenance, and it's not like the timer isn't continually smacked around to explain breakage outside of normal wear and tear. So even for a lame premise when compared to what the episode seemed to set up in the teaser, it's still a good idea for an episode, and like I said earlier, the genre parody of heist movies works because it's done in a tongue-in-cheek way that plays with the premise in a fun way. Like when they're about to set off on the heist and Rembrandt asks Diana how her hacking will work, and she explains it.
Well, their system is just like Windows 95. I restart it, boot to the safe mode command prompt only, delete the PWL files, restart it, and I'm in.
She's not entering the mainframe or speaking gibberish, she's doing something that sounds more like it belongs on a tech support forum than it does in a heist movie. Not to mention the exploding zipline, which seems like overkill unless you're deliberately going for parody. It's like how in Way Out West, the Western elements started to bleed into the characters, and it's the same thing here, with the group's discussion of how to break into the jewelry store sounding ridiculous, given that they're not spies or cat burglars, usually. And yet it works because the episode is self-aware enough to have Rembrandt point out all the reasons the plan is stupid. Most of their other genre parodies expect us to go along with it, but this one lets us know that they're in on the joke. On to more broad positives, the acting isn't bad. Jerry O'Connell might have stopped giving a crap, but I never really felt that from anyone else, even Cleavant Derricks, who I would have absolutely understood and wouldn't have blamed him for phoning it in when he's the last remaining original cast on the show that, prior to John Rhys-Davies' departure, was always said to have a family atmosphere. Everyone has emotion, everyone seems to be having fun, and even the random character interactions aren't stiff and forced. That scene at the jewelry store and right after are a little too goofy broad comedy for me, but they seem like real friends, which isn't something that Sliders had that often from Exodus onwards. Derricks, Wurr, Locke, and Floyd really seem like they're having a blast making the episode, which is always nice to see. And it's good that Diana's getting in on the one-episode love interest thing. Listen, I think it's a dumb thing that they always do it, especially since romance between a main character and a guest star can extend past a single episode, since we know they aren't adding any new cast members, but at least it's equal opportunity. And it's nice that Diana gets more plots, especially since Tembi Locke is a good enough actress to pull them off, apart from just being the brainy exposition machine. The guest cast are serviceable enough, Lisa Stahl is a good enough enough actress, although the guy who played Grant was kinda stiff and boring. And the world has an interesting history with these living gems having just been discovered. In Season 5, it always seemed like an afterthought on the similar but different worlds. Like, the first 2 seasons, whatever the world was, that was the premise of the episode. They usually scratched below the surface, unless it was just a stopover world for the teaser. With Season 5, it's more like, here's the plot and, oh yeah, this is the world where everyone worships Cthulhu. Not that we get anything that interesting from the show at this point, but you know what I mean. This isn't the living gem world. This is the, oh yeah, there are living gems on this world. And also a film festival for some reason, because they like to overcomplicate things. Then again, I guess they have to justify why some rich heiress is staying at the friggin' Chandler Hotel. In certain parts, the writing is particularly idiotic in this one. For example, the opening conversation, while interesting, since it gives us a chance to have some non-episode relevant and admittedly clunky plot exposition about the premise of the show, and it also has some nice interaction between Rembrandt and Mallory, but their conversation is stupid if you put even a modicum of thought into it. Mallory remarks that the current world they're on is nice.
You know, if more worlds were like this one, we could probably open up a trans-dimensional travel agency.
Except that's stupid because, as Rembrandt says not 2 seconds later,
Not my California, but it's close.
I want someone to tell me why the hell I would pay a likely exorbitant fee to a travel agency to send me a world that's essentially like my own, except it isn't. They've been to countless exciting worlds, and you'd fill the agency up with the boring ones? Like, yeah, obviously Soviet world or dinosaur world or anti-technology world would suck and you wouldn't want to travel there, but they visited several worlds that were both interesting and tame, like Eggheads. Yeah, it was bad for Quinn and Arturo because they were involved in dicey stuff, but for most other people, that world would be fun, give the nerds a chance to be jocks. Or New France from the first Cro-Mag episode. That was pretty safe, yet interesting. Before the Cro-Mags invaded. Okay, so there aren't that many that are both interesting and safe, but you get my point. It's a dumb idea for a hustle is all I'm trying to say. And of course, the transphobia. Nuff said. I shouldn't have to explain why it comes down to perpetuating the idea that Mallory was tricked because Monique wasn't upfront about her gender, and how funny it is that Mallory might have had gay sex, as if violence against transgender people, particularly trans women, for that very reason of they tricked me, isn't a huge problem. I know it's the 90s, but that doesn't excuse it. And to make matters worse, there's also what might be the semblance of a gay joke, since our sassy Latin desk clerk seems a little too eager when Diana tells him that the maitre d' wants to see him in the kitchen. Although that one doesn't seem to be played up for laughs nearly as much as the stuff about Monique was, so your mileage may vary on that, and that's just how I perceived it. Maybe it wasn't a gay joke. But yeah, transphobic jokes are wrong, and its presence essentially ruins a good episode, especially because it has no bearing on the plot except for being a cheap joke. Like, okay, Ace Ventura is bad too, but at least the reveal is tied into the plot, so you can't really remove it without breaking the narrative, so you have to just throw the whole movie away. With this episode, it's a normal, perfectly serviceable episode for 42 minutes, and then bam, a cheap transphobic joke right before the credits roll for no reason other than a cheap laugh. Otherwise, the joke has no bearing on the plot. If you remove the joke, apart from the snickers and giggles as they go into the vortex, the episode plays as it did without the joke. Monique as the burglar still makes sense, which makes it a bad joke not just from a human decency standpoint, but from a technical standpoint as well, since screenwriting professors are so fond of pointing out, everything in a scene is supposed to serve the plot, and that joke doesn't. Oh, and trans rights, in case there was ever any doubt. The other humor of the episode, if you can even call it that, especially with Monique, is all about name-dropping celebrities. Even though, as an alternate Earth, the idea that all these big celebrities, like Arnold Schwarzenegger, are still the exact same big celebrities is a bit of a stretch, even for Sliders. The most divergence we get, I think, is a Steven Seagal as James Bond joke, but that's barely even a joke. But really, my main complaint is that it's all like Hollywood in-jokes, which means that this episode has the same humor base as Superstar Limo. And honestly, I think I'd rather ride that 12 times instead of rewatching this episode again. I think it's a better way to spend 40 minutes, if I'm being honest. Ultimately, there are two schools of thoughts on how to fix this episode. The first of which is to eliminate the opening segment shoe shopping joke and being trapped in the vortex, and have the episode open with him going through the vortex, getting immediately sucked back in, and have that happen a few times, no more than 3 different distinct worlds, setting up that the timer is busted and requiring the heist genre parody. And the rest of the episode progresses as it did, except of course removing the transphobia at the end because it adds nothing, and is really offensive. Not very exciting, I know, but as much as I hate to praise late season Sliders, by season 5's end, they'd started to really hone in on what tone they were going for, and like shows like Star Trek Enterprise might have started to reach the heights that everyone had hoped for. Season 5, for the most part, disregarding Requiem, which is bad because it's just a bad episode in concept and execution, was at worst middling and phenomenal at best. I still maintain, 6 years after I said in my review of The Unstuck Man, that Applied Physics is the best Season 5 episode, and almost the best episode of the show since John Rhys-Davies left. It's just that the show was, ironically, held back by the fact that it was still Sliders, despite having nearly lost every other aspect of its identity. The second school of thought is to go all in on the Trapped in the Vortex plot and jettison the heist elements, have the episode open with the timer fritzing and the teaser goes as it did, but when they return, they're still stuck and the timer inoperative for some reason. But Diana thinks she can fix it. But it'll turn out that it's not necessarily the timer's fault. It's actually because of Dr. Oberyn Geiger. If you're new here, I'll give you a short recap of Season 5's premise here because you kinda need to know it. And because honestly, even I've started to forget it after doing these videos for so long. At the start of Season 5, the Sliders timer was hijacked by Dr. Oberyn Geiger, played by Peter Jurasik of Babylon 5 fame. He's an interdimensional scientist and traveler who has become unstuck, and so is pulled across the multiverse against his will unless he's in a special containment unit. His experiments led to Quinn being merged with Mallory and caused Colin to become unstuck like Geiger. Geiger was also Diana and Mallory's boss until they realized that he was going to destroy the multiverse and combine them all into one, like Zoom in Season 2 of The Flash, or like what happened after Crisis on Infinite Earths, except for no reason other than personal selfish gain, rather than saving the multiverse, which would customarily kill an unknowable amount of people, and rebelled, joining the Sliders. They also destroyed his containment unit at the end of the episode, sending him to parts unknown. Although he reappeared in Applied Physics the immediate episode after, having tracked Diana down somehow, but was again sent into the ether until he reappeared in the penultimate episode of the season, Eye of the Storm. So my idea is that Geiger trapped them there as revenge for essentially doing the same to him, leaving him to float through the void for all eternity. From there, I think ultimately, as much as I dislike them usually, would be the perfect place to implement a clip show, where the group reminisces about their experiences, both together and prior to meeting their new teammates, allowing the show a chance to revisit its history, since this is the 4th to last episode of the entire series, and it seems like a good place to do it. And I know what you're all thinking. Michael, you've made 2 episodes of How to Fix It since the pandemic started, and first you say that Aliens in Highlander 2 is a good idea, and now you're suggesting a clip show? Have you lost your goddamn mind after a year of being isolated from the rest of humanity? Yes, I did, but that's entirely unrelated to what I'm saying in this review. Clip shows aren't inherently lazy or bad. They can be used to show changes in character development or just the show in general. Power Rangers Dino Charge, I think, implemented their Halloween clip show fairly well with their imposter gimmick, so it can be done right. And I think that using it here to allow us to see just how much Rembrandt and Maggie have changed, and even seeing how much Mallory and Diana have changed from their initial appearances, and letting the show look back at its history before it rides off into the sunset is a pretty good idea. Plus, it would be nice to see Quinn, Wade, Arturo, and yes, even Colin again, even if just in archive footage. Speaking of Colin, since he's also unstuck, I'd have Colin come in at the end, likely not played by Charlie O'Connell, just a stand-in, having sensed the others, or perhaps even with Diana realizing that Colin might be there, and sending him a message to let him come in and save the day, giving Colin the send-off that he never really got, since at least Quinn will have his potential return teased in the penultimate episode, but Colin is essentially forgotten. And that's pretty much it. Either lose the Trapped in the Vortex or go all in on it. And always jettison the transphobia. And that was To Catch a Slider, which, apart from one solitary heinous joke and two pretty sexist ones, was a fairly decent episode of the show and definitely one of the better genre parodies they did. I don't think I like it nearly as much as Way Out West, but it's nowhere near the terribleness of Requiem, though few episodes are. So now I know why it always lost the poll. Outside of the ending, it's a decent episode. Although that probably means that the next time I do a poll, it's gonna hurt. But until then, thanks for watching, be sure to subscribe, leave a comment because it's good for engagement, and I'll see you next time. The opening of the episode is the episode of the opening